Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our webinar this evening, IEEE Young Professionals webinar series. Um, Today, our webinar is Leadership Excellence Part 5, part of a series that we've had this year for our webinar series of 2014. And today's webinar is on effective negotiating and collaboration. And we've asked Corey Addison to come join us again to talk about this subject. But before, I want to talk a little bit about myself. So my name is Matthew Carius. I'm the webinar specialist for the MGA Young Professionals Board. I'm also the vice chair for the Toronto Young Professionals Affinity Group. So that's where I'm located in Toronto. And just for those of you who may or may not know, IEEE Young Professionals will be hosting monthly webinars in 2014, and we will be continuing this into 2015, hopefully. And on effective communication, leadership, so many of the things that Corey has been talking to us about, and then some more technical talks we've also had in addition to. In terms of audience participation, questions during the webinar, please type those questions you have into the question box below, and you can upvote your questions, and then the questions with the most votes will be asked first. But hopefully we'll get through all the questions, and all questions will be answered following the webinar during a 5-minute Q&A session moderated by myself. So new name, new feel, new look. We were previously called the IEEE Graduates of the Last Decades, or Gold Affinity Group. We are now IEEE Young Professionals, as Gold was not instantly recognized as a young professional group. The new name makes it easier to find information and develop benefits for our young professional IEEE members. It's been a great success over the years. Last 2 years, the launch was officially in August. However, here in Toronto, we've had a great networking mixer of over 150 attendees. Central Texas Maker and International South by Southwest Festival in March was a great success, and the success continues on. When just last week there was another great mixer in Calgary, again launching the new brand. So again, good success there. We also have a Gold Rush blog, which is our online publication in which all young professionals can actually submit articles to and hopefully get published on our website there. Connect with our young professionals online. We have a mentor center and a resume lab, which is available to all of our young professional members. I'll be talking more of that at the end of the webinar after the questions. And please connect with us online through multiple avenues: our website, our email, Facebook. We are very active on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and of course YouTube, where all of our webinar are actually posted. So today's webinar, like I mentioned before, Leadership Excellence Part 5, Effective Negotiating and Collaboration. Our speaker, like I mentioned, is Corey Atkinson. He's a leadership and performance specialist, and he's been with us for 4 previous webinars, and the last of which to be held that was held in October, and I'm actually very excited to see what Corey has to offer for this webinar. And from this, please, Corey, take it away.
Thank you very much, Matthew, and thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. This is a very exciting topic for me, as over the past 5 years as a performance specialist, helping organizations perform better and helping organizations move effectively, help people develop themselves. The challenge is dealing with the conflict of going in different directions. And so when thinking about effective negotiating and collaborating, hopefully in the next 25 minutes we're together, I can give you some really powerful points that you can start practicing quickly, because a conversation like this one can't really be just had in a short webinar, but it is a starting place. So please sit back, take out a piece of paper, make your notes, feel free to jot down your questions. We'll take them up at the end, and open your mind to an idea on how to effectively negotiate in any situation, and then how to move into more of a collaborative approach. So let me begin. Matthew, can you hear me over there?
Sorry, I was muted. Yes, I can hear you. Perfect.
All right, thanks a lot. Just want to make sure. So let's get started. And when it comes to this whole concept of negotiating and collaborating, I always like to go back to the basics and think about, when we're in a conflict, where should we really begin? What's happening? And I found that the secret to managing conflict, to moving into a negotiation, to managing any collaboration, is to start with yourself. And when I say that, we have to ask ourselves 4 key questions that can really get us better prepared for how to manage this. we're in a much smaller world. We're connected in so many ways that one of the things that's advisable to any person is to really be careful on how they deal with other professionals in their workplace, because of how small and how quickly we could be working right alongside them. So there are 4 things I'd like for you to consider here at the beginning of the conversation and at the end. And the first one is this one. It's, what do I want to have happen in the negotiation? What do I want to see happen? Do I want to prove my point? Do I want to make sure that I'm understood? Do I want to, get more money? What are you really working towards? And sometimes we lose sight of that. Second question we have to have is, what do I not want to have happen? What do I want to make sure I don't happen? I don't want to make sure I discredit myself. I want to make sure that I'm competent, I'm poised, I stay controlled. Are we asking ourselves these conversations when we're in conflict? Third question is, what do I want for the relationship? Is this something that's not going to matter tomorrow, or is this something that could definitely, make an impact further on, whether it be 6 months or a year from now? And as I said, with our world being so small, we have to really manage relationships well, regardless of where we are. And the fourth question I have for you is, what are you doing right now to get to where you want to go? And are you asserting yourself, or are you sitting back and maybe asking more questions? Or are you really listening for what is being said and what's not said? What's happening in that conversation? Those are 4 questions that when I deliver programs on conflict within the workplace, within organizations, between organizations, it always starts off with a little bit of self-reflection, and these are the 4. What do I want to have happen? What don't I want to have happen? What's this relationship about? And am I doing the right things? And am I doing them at the right time to get to that desired outcome? So keep those in mind as we go along, and let's get into this. So let's talk about this. And when it comes to conflict, negotiation, collaborations, there are a number of key aspects that we look at, and that's our focus, is to discover, learn, and apply some of these into your respective day-to-day world, whatever it might be. Now, to keep it simple, because we don't have a lot of time, there are 3 topics that I'd like to look at, just to make it simple. One is understanding conflict. What's going on in the world of conflict, and what are the foundations or principles that one has to keep in mind. Secondly, we have to understand people. I'm finding more and more that to be a great leader, to be a great team player, to be a great startup of anything, you have to understand what motivates people. So that's a big one. And then you have to also understand, how do you move? How do you manage that conversation? What's the process that one wants to make sure they're using to get from point A to point B? So let's take a look at how we go through these 3 and hopefully give you some key tactics to use when negotiating and collaborating. So let's start off with step number 1, and that, of course, is understanding conflict. And understanding conflict is a big thing, because there's so many different forms of conflict, and because we're so diverse and so many different perspectives and contexts, is that realizing that there's many different types of conflict is step 1. And you can see here, recognizing conflict in its earliest stage helps prevent any other problems. Now, there are typically 5 types of conflict that I've noticed in the workplaces or in any organization. There's the relationship conflict, the way people relate to one another or towards an idea. It's data conflict, and are we getting enough information to make the right decisions? On top of that, there's obviously the interest conflicts, and that can happen more at a senior level organization, or of course in the political sphere, in terms of we have our conflicts of interest. Or there's structural conflict, and sometimes it's the nature of the business. I work with a lot of organizations that say, how do we deal with these difficult customers or difficult situations or difficult colleagues? And sometimes it's the nature of the business. It's the structure of the business that causes a person to be difficult. And once you've identified that that's the problem, then you have a bit different mindset on how to deal with it. And then there's value conflicts, and that can hit home. That can be a big reason why people will leave an organization, why they'll stay. So those are the large 5. Those are like what I call the magic 5 in terms of types of conflict that we run into in some shape, way, or form, or we're always juggling within our day-to-day life. Now, given that this is for young professionals, people that hopefully are, you're engaged in employment or you're looking towards that, I thought I'd go one step further and dig a little deeper in terms of the conflict piece, in terms of conflict at work specifically, because that changes everything. And you'll find that when it comes to conflict at work, for the conversation we're having today, there are really just 4 sort of aspects of that. There's differences in style and how we get things done. Marketing or sales might be very outgoing and very brash. Service might be more cautious. Finance might be very much more quiet. And how we interact with those people can cause some conflict, right? On top of that, we're going to have differences in background. That can be either with a new person on an organization versus a senior person, or it can be somebody who's worked in another business on the client side and now is working on the supplier side. They have a very different perspective, and that can sort of rub heads with somebody else within the group. Then, of course, you have differences in personality. We just don't get along. We just don't see eye to eye. That person's way they communicate, the way they carry themselves just rubs me in the wrong way. And then lastly, in my world, the dimension of leadership will have differences in leadership. Now, I'd like for you to make note of these: style, background, personality, and leadership, because the question I like to ask audiences is which one is the biggest problem? Some of you might have guessed it. Some of you might be off. Many people will jump to leadership, but I've seen in work I've done through the CSTD, the Canadian Society for Training and Development, and other training organizations and HR associations, the number one reason why people are let go from companies is because of their personality. And not say their personality was a problem, but because they weren't able to be flexible with who they were working with in terms of changing the way they do things or being able to adapt to others. So when you think of those, you have to realize that it really comes down to ourselves and how do we approach the situation? Are we asking ourselves, like I said before, the right questions? Now, to just sort of fast track a little bit, how do we deal with these? How do we deal with these four? How do we deal with the five before? Well, it comes down to that simple concept of trust, right? And that's a key step in managing conflict, working through negotiation, and creating a collaborative environment. It comes down to trust. And I've talked about it in some of the other workshops, webinars that we've done earlier this year, but I just wanted to go back to it because it's very interesting, because you'll find here is that when you're in some type of conflict or in some type of negotiation or trying to find a way to make sure that we're all on the same page, the two things that well up in a person's mind is concern and competence, right? And you'll notice what I have here. We must constantly communicate that you are competent and that you have a sense of concern about your counterpart. Otherwise, no trust will be built and you will not be able to move forward. You see, if you're always focused on competence, you might get their respect, and that's great. If you're low in competence and you're low in concern, well, they're not going to trust you. They're not going to share what they're dealing with. Now, if you have a highest level of concern and a low level of competence, they might sense there's a bit of a connection here. But those three don't get you to solving the problems. One must evoke or exude a level of concern in the way they communicate, the words they choose, the way they say things, but then also be competent in the way they frame their point of view to ultimately, when they show a high level of concern, a high level of competence, you are able to build trust. Much like with all of you here, if I was talking in this webinar all about a particular industry, I would not be showing a great sense of concern for my audience because they might not be from that particular industry. So I open it up and I say, depending on where you're coming from. So just to give you a little insight, and hopefully you'll sort of make a mental note of this little graphic I have here, a high level of competence and a high level of concern will get you to build trust with the person you're dealing with, which then helps you move into the negotiation and the collaboration. Now, oftentimes people say, "But how do I deal with it, Corey? How do I go about working with different styles of negotiators?" And there typically is five, much like our other five types of conflict that I've shared with people that I found really makes the difference. I got the sort of the five hats here, and this comes from a number of psychologists and specialists over the years that have done some work, and I've sort of put them together into a sort of a larger group just to give you a sense of context. Now, as I present these five, realize that there are pros and cons to each one, and I will let you at the end of looking at each five, give you some tips on how to use which one and when to use it. So sit back for a moment and look at them. So there's five styles of way that are typical for the way a person deals with a negotiation. There's the competitor. They want to assert themselves, get their point across. They're up for a win or lose conversation. They do all these different types of things. And if you need a quick decision, it's the kind of thing that you want to have, somebody who's really going to get their point across. But if there needs to be a discussion and we need to look at sides much more broadly, might not be the best. But a competer can definitely come up. Again, it depends on the situation. From your competer, then you have your accommodator. This person values relationship over the objectives. I'd much rather get along with you and make sure there's peace versus making sure that I exerted myself. They'll sacrifice themselves a little bit now for the longer gain. But this is not a good style for us to use when there are serious issues on the table. If you feel a party you're representing is going to be felt betrayed, a client is going to lose, accommodating is not the way to go. But it is something useful when the issue is not large. Sort of akin to the accommodator is your avoiders, and these are passive people. It doesn't have to be passive people in general. It could be even you or I in terms of depending on the situation. Because as you see my third point, if it's a minor issue, you just might not worry about it. Might not be a big deal. We're doing the event. We don't care what day it is as long as we get it done, right? Not for complex situations when there are a lot of things involved. Don't avoid the issues. Bring them up and bring them to the table. But again, there are pros and cons for the avoider. From the avoider, we get to our fourth style. That's our compromiser. And many people, when I do discuss the conflict styles in a workshop or within a group setting, they say the compromise, and that's got to be the best one, right? We use cooperation, we concede minor objectives, but we really want to make sure that we're both able to satisfy both needs, and sometimes that's not always possible, right? And so compromising is good, but it's not the one that I would say to you is the end-all and be-all. Depending on the situation, of course, it depends, right? One that you might want to put a star beside as you're making your notes is the collaborative approach. And that's a working together. That's a moving it from a me to a we conversation, moving it from I'm sitting across the table from you to I'm going to come sit beside you and let's look at the problem together, right? Now, of course, it's great if we're in a group setting, if we're merging an organization, if we have to forge into a new territory for design or production or sales, but it can take time. So it might not always be the best situation if it's a serious situation like we're going to have to shut down half of our organization or we're going to go in a different direction. We might have to move to a more of a competitive style, right? As you can see here, great for problem solving and brainstorming, but not great for minor points. So I've given you a really sort of fast track into the 5 negotiating styles. You saw them there for yourself. You got your competing, you got your accommodating, you got your avoiding, you got your compromise, your collaborative. They're all their pros and cons. Your homework is to check them out and figure out what's your typical style and how can you use it to, of course, help you in your career or with your groups that you're working with. Now, everybody has a little bit of each one. It depends on the situation. So if I could give you a tip, it would be just this one. When to use it. And some of the key factors that will determine which style to use, even if it might not be your natural, will be, is there a time issue? If time is an issue important, then maybe the collaborative might be important for a few minutes, but we might have to get into making a decision with a more competitive approach, or even a compromising approach. Is there a issue importance, right? Is this something that people have been complaining about for a long time? Maybe that might not be the best time to compete. Might be a time to find a way to either accommodate or collaborate or compromise. And then you've got the other ones, which is how important is the relationship, and of course, lastly, how much power do you have in terms of the situation? Because if you're not the top person in the group, then maybe you might have to use an accommodating or avoiding scenario for the time being, but don't let it eat you up. So keep those in mind when it comes to the different styles. Time, issue, relationship, and relative importance. That can help you determine what's your next step when dealing with any type of negotiation. So that is step one. To deal with a negotiation, to deal with collaboration, we first have to understand conflict. Once we've got to understand conflict, then, of course, the wild card, that's understanding what I would say is people, right? What do they want? Where are they coming from? And understand people, I'm going to keep it simple because we could go on for length with this one. And with this point, it really comes down to understanding fear and keeping in mind assumptions. So let's talk about fear for a moment. We've got, there are typically 4 types of fear that people carry around with us on a day-to-day basis that, dictates how we move and make our decisions, right? There's the fear of humiliation or embarrassment. That's a big one for some people, depending where you are in your life. There's the fear of failure. If I don't do anything, I won't lose out. And then there's the fear of rejection and losing power. Right? If I don't say anything, I'll be okay. And if I don't do anything, then everything will be the same. But of course, if we take no risks, we won't grow. So with that in mind, I'd like for you to consider which fear is the worst fear of all. If you had to pick one fear and say, Corey, this fear, if we could get rid of this fear from the human race, our world would be a better place, which fear would you select? Not an easy question to answer. Depending on the context, power, rejection, failure could all fall into that. But I like to look at the embarrassment as a big one because it's the one that we most tend to learn the earliest in life. Hopefully you come from a good home. And with that in mind, I'd just like to take a moment to look at them. And when we talk about humiliation, many of us, have been embarrassed, humiliated, or felt ashamed, at some type in our life. And in situations of conflict, these fears sometimes can resurface. And we don't want to be left out of the room. We don't want to be stupid, and we might not necessarily bring an idea across, and we might haunch ourselves down in our position, not be open. So fear of embarrassment can be a big one. The next one that I'll also look at is fear of failure, right? And sometimes if we don't want to ask, if we don't ask for too much, we won't be disappointed, and thus we're not putting our best foot forward in that negotiation, right? But there's this great player from Canada, this great hockey player named Wayne Gretzky, and I'll never forget, Wayne Gretzky said, "We miss 100% of the shots that we never take." And then we have, of course, fear of, I'd say, fear of rejection. Now, rejection comes in 100 different faces, right? Like being the last one picked for a sports team, or not being asked to sit on a committee, or being turned down for a job, right? And so sometimes it can be such a big part of us that we're just so fearful of hearing that we don't even move forward. And then lastly, there is the fear of losing power. And asking people for stuff makes us vulnerable. Conquer that fear of change a little bit at a time, fear of losing power. And if you don't like the outcomes, then learn from experience. But it definitely can impact how we think about things and how we deal with conflict. So understand people, understand their fears, and that'll help you sort of win the day. See, if it's not just you and I that have these fears, we all have them, including the people that we work with, including the people that we live with, including the people that we see. So what I'd like for you to keep in mind as you look at this concept of negotiating and collaborating is that if you can identify the fears they have and keep them in mind when responding, then you're already on your way to a more successful conversation. Now, another big piece of it is assumptions. You understand fears, but be mindful of assumptions. And when I say assumptions, I'm really talking about the assumptions that a person brings to the conversation, whether it be a negotiation or a collaboration, right? You see, there's some people that have the truth assumptions that I'm right, you know, you're wrong, I know the facts, you're mistaken, I understand, you don't know what you're talking about. And those are the things that sometimes come up in a conversation, in negotiation. And if you're not aware of them, it can run you, it can make things very stressful. You got the other one, which is that the other person is the problem, right? Sorry, but let me go back a second. There we go. And their way they come across in terms of being rude or arrogant or so forth can really cause us to put up a roadblock when we're dealing with a conflict or a negotiation. And then there's the last one, is that we think that we all live in the same world. We all have the same beliefs, attitudes, and experiences, which obviously we don't, but we often bring those to the table in a negotiation or a conflict, which then prohibits and definitely doesn't help us get towards any type of collaborative approach. So keep those in mind when we have that conversation, that there's an internal dialogue going on in the mind of the person that you're talking to. And that takes us to our final step, which is the negotiating process. There are many different ways of going about it, but I often tell people that there's just 4 simple things you have to do to be prepared for a negotiation. Prepare, create the conditions that will allow it to be successful. Make sure you frame the issues of what's being discussed, and keep in mind the importance of having options. What's the worst case scenario, best case scenario, and what's the middle ground. So because these are just high level points of view, I thought, let me just focus on the first one, and that is to prepare. You see, when you're in that conversation, here's all the things we have to do. Break to review, you have a well thought out agenda, leave on a positive note. But I've said it before in some of the conversations we've had over the course of the year, and I'll say it again. The secret to running a negotiation, the secret to collaboration, is to be prepared. And when I say prepared, it's being able to manage any difficult conversation you have. And I call it the prep formula, right? Because there are really 4 things that we have to do to be successful in a conversation, regardless if it's of a negotiation or a collaboration. First P is prepare, right? Where and how to begin. How are you going to open up that conversation? Very important, whether negotiating, whether collaborating. Once you're prepared, remind yourself, what are your interests? What are your wants? What are your values? What do you want? Remember those 4 questions I asked you at the beginning of the webinar. But of course, keep in mind your context of the other person. What are their interests? What are their values? What do they want? What are their needs? And then lastly, be specific. Pinpoint. We live in a busy world, and more often than not, people would like for you to get to the point. Focus on the interests of both people at the table and outcomes, and do your best to avoid the personality issues. And those are just simple techniques that one can use to help them really move forward when dealing with any conflict, negotiation, or collaboration. Now, as we wrap things up, people say, well, Corey, this looks great, but sometimes it's not that easy. What if there's no way to move forward? Well, that's when you have to find a way to sort of what I call manage the impasse and find a way to get through it. And how do we unlock horns when we're sitting there in that discussion, whether it be with a colleague or, of course, even maybe in a negotiation with a client? So there are a couple tips I can give you. First, restate. Be sure the other person knows you are making reasonable efforts to understand their point of view. When they make a comment, restate or rephrase to make sure that you've heard what they've said clearly. Gives you time to think, lets them know you're listening. Stay flexible. When listening, do your best to stop for a moment and say, let me just think about some options that could work here. A lot of times we go into these negotiations, we don't have options, and thus the stalemate appears. Validate and affirm areas of agreement. Go back for a moment and reflect on or review what's been agreed. Clarify. What basis are we looking to make some decisions? Or is there a place where you can find some small wins that will help you move to the bigger ones? And lastly, take a break. Depending on how long it's going, if it's a late night event with a team or just something that's not going well with the client, don't hesitate to say, you know what, I'd like to take a moment to step back and look back at my game plan to make sure that I'm giving you the best options possible. But make sure, as it says here, make sure that people do their homework. So I've given you a few tactics and ideas on how to manage any impasse or any difficult situations. Of course, there's many more, but these can get you started. And so with that in mind, that sort of gives us a context of, gives us sort of a point of, here's how we deal with conflict. Here's how we deal with a negotiation, that when we put all these tactics into place, understanding people, understanding conflict, and of course, understanding the process, helps us negotiate better and of course, communicate better, which helps us in anything we do. So let's stop there. I'm going to go back to what I started with. Where do we begin? If you're keeping these three things in mind of understanding people, understanding conflict, understanding the process, then once again, your step one that will help you manage any of these situations will be those 4 questions. Do you remember them as I asked this earlier in the webinar? The first one is, what do you want to see happen? What don't you want to have happen? How important is the relationship? And lastly, what are you doing or what are we not doing to get that desired outcome? Those are just the key elements that can get you started on having a great conversation to manage a negotiation or develop a collaborative approach to a problem. But I could go on for lengths on other tactics and techniques, but hopefully this gives you a great start. Once again, to recap, we've covered all 3 aspects, and again, we could go on further, but hopefully this gives you something to think about over the course of the holidays or the seasons, and something that you can hopefully put into practice when you're back in your day-to-day lives with people, places, or of course with your colleagues at work. Once again, everyone, my name is Corey Atkinson. It's been a great time talking with all of you. My organization is Dimensions of Leadership. By all means, find me on the web and feel free to email me if you have other questions. But I do have some time for some questions, so if Matthew, you have any questions you'd like for me to answer, please, by all means, go ahead.
Thanks, Corey, for a great talk. Very, very inspiring. Just to start things off, so for those of you watching, please type your questions in the question box below, and I'll ask them. So this talk was very. I saw the connections between this talk and some of the talks that you the talk you had about dealing with difficult people and things like that, and everyone having a different style, which was interesting. But then going back to why our fears, and you listed 4 or 5 of them there, and then you asked the question, which one do you think is the most popular? And the first thing that came to my mind was, well, I think that's very dependent on the type of person you are, right? So in my case, for example, I do not have the fear of being humiliated, so that's not a fear of mine in these situations. But maybe losing power or not taking it as seriously, maybe that's a fear. So in your experience, how does that play? How do different people's fears play into this whole negotiation realm?
Well, Matthew, you're right. The context of the person is definitely a big part of it. You can imagine, what I do for a living, going out into organizations as such as you probably do. Fear of humiliation is not that big a deal. That being said, if we go deeper with that whole sense of fear of humiliation, one of the things that goes back, even to maybe if we want to get into Greek tragedy, is that pride and hubris that people have. Nobody, Matthew probably agrees. Nobody ever wants to look bad. So right. With that in mind, that fear of embarrassment does play a role. Now, once again, though, to give you context, yeah, the only thing that you can do if that isn't the case is be mindful of those things. And then in the conversation or the negotiation, asking the kind of questions that dictates, is the person worried about losing power? Is the person worried about doing something that maybe they haven't had an okay with, or their team hasn't been on the same page, so then maybe they'll lose some, they'll be rejected, or they're just scared of taking that risk and going so out of the box that it might not work, which would be humiliation. So the best way to find out what that fear in that person might have, that person that you're talking to might have, is to ask those questions that dictates or tells you a little bit insight into what that fear might be. Because again, depending on the situation, the fear would be very different. Does that help you out a little bit?
Yeah, no, that's a perfect answer. Thank you for that. Moving on to another question from Laura from the UK. Very relevant question. How can I build trust with people who have completely different personalities than me? I've tried several things, but I'm just not sure sometimes how to go about this. Many of the people I work with are concerned and competent, like you mentioned with that graphic, but we still clash. So
Well,
how do you, in other words, if you still have that trust, but your personalities are different. So again, working with difficult people comes into this.
you know what? That definitely goes back to our last webinar, Matthew.
Yeah.
Laura, that's a tricky one, because we have that sense of concern as professionals and competence in our day-to-day work lives, but sometimes there's a sense of, and I'm not sure how things are maybe in Europe, but I'm getting a sense here in North America, we're so busy with our head down. It's do more with less time, less money, less resources, that sometimes we just get our head down and we don't take a moment to step back and think about, who am I talking to? And Laura, it's not an easy battle, but I can tell you that the moment you start being more intentional in how you deal with difficult people, whether you limit your interaction with them or you ask questions that sort of connect with the way they see the world, you'll see them eventually change. But it takes time. The other big factor is sometimes, because we got our head down, we're so busy working, is that Laura might do that great thing, but the leader of the group isn't displaying those behaviors. Thus, the behavior that Laura just demonstrates falls on deaf ears. So there's no one thing you can do except to make sure that you're resilient and that you have a bit of a strategy, but know that it's going to take time. I would not be able to do you justice to answer your one question completely in this confines of the conversation now, but definitely please email me and I might be able to give you some more tactics once I get more context. But I think the key thing you take away is be resilient, but also be very intentional in trying to understand that other person's personality. Hopefully that helps you out, Laura.
Perfect. And I think we have one last question here from Mario here in Canada. Do you think our technology today, so email, text messages, is causing a lot of miscommunication and possibly leading to conflict? Do you have suggestions on how we can continue to use such communication but to minimize conflicts that may result? Text messages and emails are great for communication, but it's causing a lot of miscommunication. So what are your thoughts on that?
So Mario's asking me, do I think that those things are causing more problems?
Yes.
Definitely. They're definitely causing problems in our world. It hasn't changed. One of the greatest ways that we communicate is by facial expression and body language. And now I can send you a quick text message and not really be in touch with what's happening or spell typos or so forth. Or we send emails and we think that everybody understands where we're coming from. So that's the tricky part, Mario, is that we have to step back as a professional, as somebody who's worried about their own professionalism, and just say, what can I do to make sure I'm communicating clearly? So for example, I will be in touch with you or Matthew, and we'll be in touch via email and so forth, but I'm going to make sure that I'm going to touch base with you via phone an hour, 2 hours before any meeting or anything that we do. And I'm just taking on as a professional. Others don't do that, and we just show up at the meeting and we expect everybody to be there. So there's no, the only thing that we can do is to start on our own and make sure that as we move forward, hopefully our good habits will rub off on others. And when we are in leading a group or managing a group, we make sure to display the behaviors that will make sure communication flows smoothly, still using the technological advances that our world makes with regards to them. So hopefully that gives you some insight. Start with ourselves, because of course it's not going to change, and they're going to keep coming in terms of how people communicate via technology. Hopefully that answers your question, Mary.
Yeah. So maybe just to summarize that, so how to minimize conflicts in this email text message world. So you gave the example of calling them before meeting, or could you maybe elaborate on what specifically could be done?
What specifically done, Matthew? Well, here's the thing, right? It's getting clear, I think, on what is email and text messages for. They're for short, quick confirmations of information. But of course, the thing that we have to keep in mind as professionals is that there's sometimes context can be missed in that conversation. So therefore, as a professional, I think it's important for us to make sure that we take a proactive approach. Maybe that's what you're looking for, to make sure that communication is clear. So let's say, for example, there's been a back and forth. A couple of emails have gone back between a person, and there's, well, I said this, well, I told you it was in this drive, or, well, we told the client this last week. If you're noticing that communication on an issue, it goes beyond 3 emails, a good best practice is to say, you know what, 3 emails, let me pick up the phone and make sure that I'm clear on what's happening. That's the kind of thing that I would say to somebody. Or if you're copied on an email, but you're not the real person who's being emailed, take a moment to call that person and say, hey, I noticed, Corey, you copied me on that email. How is that going between you and Mario in that conversation? So you take that proactive approach that can really help things sort of nip things in the butt before they become an issue. But again, it comes down to the person, Matthew. There's not much else I could tell you except for that. Because, of course, we use them all the time, and sometimes we forget the problems that they can cause for ourselves.
No, those are definitely great pointers, because the first thing that came to my mind when you said, "Oh no, pick up the phone or do whatever," was video chat, but it doesn't seem like that's the answer as well. But
no, Matthew, that's one tool, but it's not the only answer, as you probably know.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Perfect. Great conversation thus far. I don't think we have any more questions. Nothing else came up, but it was a great conversation. Thank you, Corey, for again giving such a great webinar. I'm gonna slide over to my slides now. But again, Corey, thank you very much for taking the time and talking to our young professionals.
No problem. It's a pleasure, and we'll look forward to seeing all of you in 2015.
Perfect. So thank you everyone for participating. Please complete the feedback survey, which I'll be giving out within the hour, hopefully. Our next professionals webinar is a bit technical, a bit educational, on January 21st, 2015, 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Jason Long will be talking to us about re-engineering engineering education, the Magical MPG program, which is an excellent program that he started out west in Canada, and is teaching engineers how to use microprocessors, I believe, at a young age. Please check out our career-based services for young professionals. The Mentor Center will be actually trying to link up mentees and mentors from around the world into fields that young professional members are interested in. Also, we have the Resume Lab for all young professionals to be a part of, and tips and tricks on how to format your resume. Suggestions for other young professionals, products, and services, email us, catch us on the web. Again, thank you everyone for participating in this webinar, and I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Thank you. Bye.